Now I also introduce Mr. Jackie Lee. He is the Sales and Marketing Manager of Cisema, Hong Kong Limited. Jackie focuses on marketing updates of the medical devices in China, including Hong Kong and Greater Bay Area. Presents market research insights in articles on Cisema's website, and also provides customized consulting services for clients. Without further ado, let me pass the floor on to Mr. Kane and Mr. Lee.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Jackie.
Today, we will first talk about the regulatory framework and infrastructure of the current Hong Kong listing applications for medical devices, before exploring the China NMPA registration process and regulatory regime, and finish with discussing how Hong Kong listing could allow sales into the Greater Bay Area.
Just in case you have any questions during the webinar, there will be 10 minutes of Q&A at the very end. So please do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat box, and then we will answer them in the Q&A section.
We had over 70 participants sign up for the webinar, so thank you all very much for your attendance.
We would also like to thank the Hong Kong Medical and Healthcare Device Industries Association for organizing this event with us.
So this is just a short overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, we will give a quick overview of the Greater Bay Area Initiative and implications for medical device and IVD manufacturers before we talk in more detail about Hong Kong listing requirements and then China NMPA registration requirements, before we dive into some alternative pathways such as the Hainan Boao-Licheng pilot zone, because that has interesting analogy for the Greater Bay Area Initiative, which we will then discuss in detail. And then we'll finish up with Q&A at the end. Briefly about us, we had an introduction to begin with from KM Chow. Thank you very much. Cisema is a CRO and regulatory affairs consultant for China regulatory. We were founded in 2002 in Munich and China, and we have nearly 100 full-time employees globally.
The Hong Kong Medical and Healthcare Device Industries Association. We hope this webinar will help bring some value and insights to companies in the healthcare and medical device industries sector. If you are interested to know more about our company, or if you have any further inquiries, feel free to send us an email.
Just a little bit to recap about us personally. I'm a lawyer by training, as Dr. Chow mentioned. I'm Australian originally, but now called Hong Kong home, and I'm CEO at Cisema.
And a little bit more about myself. I studied my bachelor's in Canada, and I'm also right now the lead in Cisema to support the Hong Kong and China regulatory affairs for our customers from Taiwan and Hong Kong. Since 2019, or even earlier, the implementation of a special policy was introduced by the Chinese and Hong Kong governments that permits the use of Hong Kong registered drugs and common medical devices in designated Hong Kong-owned healthcare institutions in the Greater Bay Area.
The implementation process has steadily moved forward since first being announced, and it's gathered momentum recently, as we'll talk about later in our presentation. In particular, a November 2019 announcement about GBA integration referred to medical device sales. Once the policy is finally adopted, manufacturers can consider the voluntary listing in Hong Kong as a crucial entrance point to an important part of the Chinese market and to China-wide registration with the NMPA.
In this slide, we would like to highlight that 27 Hong Kong-owned healthcare institutions have been set up in the Greater Bay Area already in 2019. This indicates a great opportunity to manufacturers planning to enter the Greater Bay Area, especially for cutting-edge global medtech companies planning to import their products into China. According to the Hong Kong Census and Statistics Department, the Hong Kong service-based industries rely heavily on imports. The total medical equipment imports in 2019 amounted to $2.66 billion. The United States was the market leader in the high-end market segment, capturing 18% of the total import market. Hong Kong is a medical products and equipment sourcing base for mainland China and other destinations. Accounting for 35% of Hong Kong's medical product and equipment exports, mainland China is the largest market.
We can talk about the GPA policy pathway in sufficient detail. We will now move on to first lay the groundwork by presenting the Hong Kong listing process and the NMPA registration process.
So just a quick overview of the current organization structure of the Hong Kong government's Food and Health Bureau. The Medical Device Control Office, MDCO, was established in 2004 as a division under the Department of Health. In the same year, they launched the Medical Device Administrative Control System, the MDACS, which features a voluntary listing system for medical devices, under which manufacturers and importers could list their medium to high-risk medical devices and IVDs with the Department of Health. In 2019, the MDCO renamed themselves as MDD, the Medical Device Division, and continues to be responsible for the MDACS and the development of a long-term statutory regulatory framework for medical devices. Both the DOH, the Department of Health, and the HA, Hospital Authority, are responsible to report to the Food and Health Bureau. The Hospital Authority is a statutory body managing all the government hospitals and institutes in Hong Kong. The reason for mentioning this is because they are responsible for purchasing medical devices for Hong Kong public hospitals. Medical devices commonly used in Hong Kong hospitals would be a great factor for meeting one of the requirements to enter the Greater Bay Area.
Although it's voluntary to apply for listing of medical devices in Hong Kong, the Hospital Authority has a higher preference for listed medical devices in public tenders. Therefore, we encourage manufacturers interested in the Greater Bay Area in particular to apply for Hong Kong listing. In this slide, we include a comparison table prepared by the Hong Kong Medical Device Division addressing the current regulatory control of medical devices in Hong Kong and the mandatory registration of medical devices that is expected to come in the future. We advise manufacturers to have their medical devices listed, the sooner the better, because the voluntary registration process is intended to alleviate some of the expected rush of applications when it becomes mandatory.
So since the launch of the MDACS system in 2004, the relevant legislation to enforce mandatory requirements has already been mentioned. However, it has still not been implemented and currently remains in draft form. Although the final version of the medical device bill and the latest proposed version may not be exactly the same, we expect that the framework will be more similar to China's currently regulatory regime. We expect some changes in the terminologies used, for instance, from listing to registration and local responsible person to authorized representative, as seen in this slide. According to the current MDACS system in Hong Kong, it is based on the principles of medical device classification proposed by the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. Medical devices and IVDs are separately grouped into 4 classes, according to the risk level associated with their intended use. Class 4 medical devices and Class D IVDs bear the highest risk, whereas Class 1 medical devices and Class A IVDs bear the lowest risk. One interesting fact is that the China regulatory body, NMPA, is one of the IMDRF Management Committee members. And last year in October, the IMDRF accepted a proposal on post-market clinical follow-up studies. This shows a growing global leadership and maturity of the Chinese regulator and the Chinese medical device industry.
On this slide, we've provided a snapshot of the web-based classification program provided by the Hong Kong Medical Device Division website. It follows the classification. Apologies, I think we're just having a technical issue there. Hope everyone can hear us okay. Now, okay, so this is a website that you're probably familiar with, but it is very useful if you're not. After the applicant answers a series of questions generated automatically on the website, depending on the answer to 10 or so questions, the applicant will be able to use this as a reference to help identify which risk class of the medical device listing should be applied for. However, the applicant should also bear in mind that the final decision will depend on the Hong Kong Medical Device Division after they've reviewed the submitted application dossier.
Set up on this slide is a simple overview of the application process for listing medical devices in Hong Kong. Applications require at least 22 weeks of processing time. If the manufacturer wishes to apply for inclusion of a device into the list of medical devices, but does not have a registered place of business in Hong Kong, the company must designate a local responsible person that must have a valid Hong Kong business registration certificate. Therefore, similar to many global regulatory systems, including NMPA, CE mark in Europe, US FDA, a local presence is required. In Hong Kong, only the medium to high-risk medical devices and IVDs can be listed on the MDACS system, which means Class 1 medical devices and Class A IVDs won't be able to apply for listing. Successful device applications will receive a listing number and be listed in the MDACS online database. The listing will be valid for 5 years. As of today, there is no application fee for listing medical devices on the MDACS system. However, foreign manufacturers should expect the cost for appointing a local responsible person in Hong Kong. This is something that we at Cisema regularly do for our customers as well. The benefits of appointing a regulatory affairs specialist as your LRP includes collecting the required documents for dossier submission, handling post-market matters, and maintaining effective communication with the manufacturer.
Just a reminder to please go on mute if participants could while we're until the end of the Q&A. Thank you.
The government official, the communication with the manufacturer, the government official, and other related parties. And in this slide, we've provided a breakdown of the application particulars for MDACS listing. I would like to share some practical tips from common problems based on the experience we had with our clients for their listing application. So the Hong Kong MDD can be quite strict with the contact information details stated on the documents, such as the manufacturer's address. Since certificates like the ISO 13485 and other foreign market approval certificates, they will have the manufacturer's address printed on it. However, this may not always be up to date. For example, the manufacturer may have relocated to a different address, but still be waiting for the certificate issuing body to provide the certificate with the updated information. The applicant will have to ensure all the required documents for dossier submission up to date. Otherwise, there will be additional processing time. If you refer to the particulars of the device in the table, the conformity assessment certificates is optional for some cases when the applicant's marketing approval certificate does not meet the MDACS requirement. Normally, applicants will be able to use their existing marketing approval certificates granted by authorities in either one of the countries as listed in the table on the right-hand side for the application of MDACS listing. Otherwise, they can also consider applying for a certificate from the conformity assessment bodies in Hong Kong with an extra cost, of course. Currently, there are only 3 bodies recognized by the MDACS as seen in the left table of this slide.
So now we're going to move on to the China NMPA registration aspect, just to provide a bit more detail there. As you may know, the regulator in China directly supervising medical devices, IVDs, pharmaceutical products, and cosmetics is the National Medical Products Administration, or NMPA. It was previously known as the CFDA or China FDA, but to more clearly distinguish it from its US counterpart and in a broader governmental restructure, it was renamed in 2018. As you can see from the slide, this is not the first time it was renamed and restructured. Over the last 25 years, the healthcare regulatory body has been renamed multiple times. On the right-hand side of the slide, we have depicted the current NMPA responsibility scope. It includes not only medical devices, but also in vitro diagnostics, farm products and cosmetics. As I mentioned, food-related items that we have highlighted in gray are now managed by the Center for Food Evaluation, or CFE. Every year, the NMPA publishes a report on past year's activities. The 2020 report was published in February and provides some interesting statistics on medical device and IVD registrations in China. Applications here are shown in yellow and successful submissions in blue. You can see that there was a large fall in registration numbers in 2017. This was due to stricter requirements brought in by the regulator relating to EMC, electromagnetic compatibility testing, as well as clinical trial requirements. There was also an attempt to reduce local test fees, which the test labs obviously didn't like because this took away a big source of their income. By 2019, this backlog had largely resolved, and you can see that there was an explosion in registrations in the last few years, giving an indication of the healthy demand of the market. The application and approval numbers have soared, nearly doubling to 2020.
In 2020, you can see that 9,849 medical devices, including IVDs, were registered in China out of a total of 10,579 applications. These numbers do not include Class 1 and 2 domestic products, because such applications are submitted to their respective provincial NMPAs rather than the NMPA. 6,246 medical devices, including IVDs, were registered by importers in 2020, with a breakdown approximately 2/3 medical devices and 1/3 IVDs.
The top registered countries in 2020 were the USA, which it has been for the last few years, followed by Germany, Japan, and Korea. Some of the other top 10 countries are also listed on the slide here. In terms of product groups, dental and medical imaging equipment have the leading number of registrations, followed by orthopedic implants, surgical instruments, and ophthalmic devices. The demand in China for medical imports continues to be high-end, high-cost devices. The composition of China's domestic medical production has shifted over the last 10 years from low-end consumables competing only on cost, like first aid kits, surgical gloves, and band-aids, to more technology-intensive products, including therapeutic and diagnostic devices. Despite the shift, according to a report by the State Health Planning Commission, currently Chinese companies mostly occupy the middle and low price tier of medical devices, with demand for foreign brands primarily focused in the top tier. Now getting to some of the more technical aspects of China registration. The first step when registering your medical device in China is to determine what risk class your product falls into. There are 3 levels of risk in the China classification system, with level 3 being the highest risk devices. Whilst home country risk classification is a decent indicator of your China risk class, it's not determinative. Instead, there's an extensive catalogue of product areas in China that determine what risk the product falls into. Jackie, if we just click, yeah, thank you. The relevant medical device classification catalogue was issued in 2017, but has been updated a number of times, most recently in December 2020. The catalogue vividly provides over 2,000 product examples and 22 product categories. So it's relatively straightforward to determine your risk class, provided your product appears. If it doesn't, the next step would be to look at the rules for medical device classification And if it's still uncertain, it's possible to apply for an official classification with the NMPA. This takes 2 to 3 months. Risk class, of course, determines your regulatory pathway. Class 1 medical devices go through a filing procedure. This document-based filing procedure will then lead you to a certificate which is valid indefinitely, and therefore there's no renewal necessary. On the other hand, for Class 2 and 3 medical devices, the certificate that you will receive upon successful registration is valid for 5 years. This means that a renewal application is needed, and the deadline for applying for a renewal application is officially 6 months prior to expiration. However, we remind our clients as early as 2 years beforehand, because if the test specifications or some important standards have changed, it's possible that as part of the renewal, you have to perform some local testing, and testing takes a long time. So make sure you check and keep an eye on your renewal expiry of your certificate.
After you have determined your risk classification, you need to consider naming a local representative in China, which is called the NMPA legal agent. The NMPA legal agent is a direct interface with the regulator, and it must be a Chinese legal entity. The NMPA legal agent role is required throughout the product lifecycle and is becoming increasingly important as the NMPA scrutinizes post-market activities more and more closely. Previously, the role was divided into a China registration agent role as well as an after-sales agent role. But now there is just one role, NMPA legal agent. The NMPA legal agent formally submits the application dossier, interfaces with local test labs for local testing, accepts the NMPA certificate when it succeeds, and arranges for the first import of the product. In the post-market surveillance role, the NMPA legal agent submits adverse event filings, periodic annual reports, and supports overseas factory inspections.
So on this slide, we set out the Class 1 filing process in brief. Although we said 7 weeks for the total timeline, this can be, really more generally, widely 3 to 5 months. Class 1 products don't require local testing, which is very important, and it's a filing process only. The important step here is the writing of the product technical requirements, or PTR as it's known, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's because it sets out the technical specifications of your product. The documents must be submitted in person to the NMPA counter. Once they're complete and provided it meets the formal requirements, the NMPA will issue the certificate on the spot. Notarization and the other administrative process are also just take time, and that's part of the reason for the length of the filing process. The certificate for filing looks like this for a Class 1 product. The big red stamp is obviously important. Make sure you keep the original in a safe place, because this is often needed either for market sales reasons or just to ensure that you can demonstrate that this is your product and it's registered. For Class 2 and 3 products, if we compare versus the filing, the process is a lot more complex and involves many more steps. The registration process takes 18 months for Class 2 and 21 months for Class 3 products in our experience. I've set out in this slide a timetable with breakdown of the key steps. An important reason for why the timeline is so long is the local testing requirement. Only biocompatibility testing done outside of China will be accepted by the China regulator. All other testing must be done at certified labs within China prior to submitting your registration application. The timelines shown here, of course, assume that no clinical trial is required. If it is, this can add a year or more to your timeline. Registrations are valid for 5 years. And so, as we talked about before, make sure you renew on time. Going into some of the steps in more detail, I mentioned the PTR earlier. That's the second step here. The PTR is a very important document for class 2 and 3 products. It's actually annexed to the certificate itself when you receive it from the NMPA. It's drafted initially in order to confirm what your local testing needs to be. And so there's a dialogue with the test lab that you've selected. Once the test lab agrees, it will issue an import certificate, which allows you to import the product into China without customs duties. That can be as much as 20% of the price of the product. So it's very good to obviously not have to pay that amount. That's only on the basis, though, that product will, once it's been tested, will leave the country again. In parallel to the type tests, which is the very important testing process that the test lab undergoes, the test time of 3 to 5 months is not how long the testing takes, but in our experience, really the queue to get into testing, that's the long time delay. The test time itself can be a few days or weeks, but there is such a backlog of testing, and you need to be ready and in line so that if someone withdraws, you can immediately go in and test. This is why we have local offices in Tianjin and in Shandong, because you really need to be on site and ready to go and experienced with good relations with the test labs in order to get testing done promptly and properly. You then submit your application to the NMPA. It will take 60 days to review, and in most cases issue a supplementary notice so that you can asking for more information about the product and specifics. You then have 1 year to respond and a number of chances to meet with the NMPA reviewer in person. And you only get one chance. So you need to make sure it's a comprehensive response. You'll then have your certificate issued. And that whole process is in summary set out here on the slide. Importantly, the default position is that all class 2 and 3 products must undergo clinical trials in China in order to support their NMPA application. The first step is to look at the clinical trial exemption catalog to try to, so what we're talking about here is, well, yes, clinical trials are default required, but ideally we want to avoid that if possible. First, you look at the clinical trial exemption catalog. It's updated every year or so, and most recently on 19th of January this year. If your product is listed on this list, then the simplified clinical evaluation report is sufficient, and that's the best option for avoiding clinical trial. Since 2018, the NMPA allows applicants to utilize overseas clinical trial data as well. But to meet the requirements, there are a few things to consider, including ethical, legal, and scientific principles of the NMPA. If your overseas clinical trial data qualifies, then this is a viable option. However, if you don't have your own clinical data or it doesn't meet the requirements, which are onerous because it requires a multi-center clinical trial and full ethics approval, then there's another option, which is to write a clinical evaluation report based on a predicate device. A predicate device is an equivalent device that already successfully gained NMPA approval in China. If the predicate device is from a direct competitor, however, gaining access to some of the information that is crucial for the CER will be difficult, because the competitor is not going to be happy to share confidential information such as production data or material information about its medical device. So this could be a significant hurdle unless you have a previous generation model in China. We have had some success for our customers with obtaining predicate device information through either a formal application to the NMPA, although this takes some time and will often have a lot of information redacted. Just as an aside, one question we often get asked is, how is this clinical evaluation report different from the EU CER that's submitted for the purpose of CE mark? The purpose of the CER in China is a different one. and it looks different, and it should not be written in the same way. The purpose of a Chinese clinical evaluation report is to demonstrate equivalence and justify why differences between the to-be-registered device and the predicate device do not negatively impact safety and effectiveness. Otherwise, you may consider, for example, our feasibility study report, where we look into whether you have sufficient data and can write a CER report. The CER requires expert writing in line with relevant guidance, and this is often an area where our customers appreciate our support. And it's a key competence at Cisema. What's quite interesting and exciting is the most recent additional pathway to avoid clinical trial, which is via the use of real-world data. And I'll say more about that shortly. The official submission fees for NMPA approvals for imported medical devices are set out on this slide in RMB. Class 1 products filing have no fee, while Class 2 cost 210,900 RMB for new submissions and 308,800 for Class 3 products. However, this is not a total cost. There are significant other fees, such as local testing fees, customs fees and transportation, and document drafting, logistics, etc. So when engaging a service provider to support you with this, please make sure you ask for a full cost calculation that covers everything, including the test fees and writing of all the necessary documentation. And of course, if the clinical trial is required, the number will be substantially higher. We know of a number of customers who have talked to various different people, and they're often given just a snapshot of the picture rather than the full cost, which can be significant, there's no doubt. On the other hand, fees for domestic or Chinese manufacturers look a bit different. For Class 2 manufacturers, they have to submit the application to their provincial NPA, and provincial NPAs have completely different application fees depending on the province. Some of them are heavily subsidized, and some could even be free. For domestic Class 3 products, the initial or new registration is just half the amount shown. The justification for this, provided by the NMPA, is that domestic applicants have to go through factory inspections routinely as part of their registration application, whilst overseas factory inspections will be conducted only if there is a serious concern or an adverse event.
International Medical Tourism Zone, also known as the Hope City. It sits within the Hainan Free Trade Zone on the island of Hainan. Some people call it China's Hawaii. To cater for wealthy Chinese who might otherwise go abroad for their medical care, the Chinese government encouraged development of a medical tourism zone in order to benefit from a business model of having medical treatment in a top-level holiday region. This requires access to the most innovative medical technology. The Hainan Pilot Zone was approved by the State Council in 2013 and accommodates a number of Chinese and foreign cooperative medical institutions within the roughly 20 square kilometers area. Importantly, medical devices and IVDs are not otherwise registered with the NMPA, can be imported into the pilot zone and sold to hospitals within the pilot zone with the approval of the Hainan Provincial NPA. Once a product is approved for use within the pilot zone, the product can, with the consent of the Hainan NPA and the NMPA, collect real-world data on Chinese nationals, which can then be used as supplementary evidence for an NMPA registration that would enable China-wide sales. Hospitals within the pilot zone are closely involved in the process and would need to submit the import application to Hainan NPA. In parallel, the manufacturer applies to NMPA for real-world data approvals. There are two focus areas for NMPA with respect to such applications. The product should be urgently needed for clinical use, and there should be no products of the same variety in China. However, further clarity is still awaited from the authorities because these focus areas are still being developed. Even so, it can be considered for companies with products that meet the criteria and are interested in staged entry into the mainland market with the potential to save time and receive revenues during the lengthy approval process. The medical tourism pilot zone is expected to be fully open by 2030. Numbers so far are lower than predicted as prices are relatively high. Hospitals are trying to connect their medical services to the country's government health and medical insurance programs in the hopes of attracting more customers.
Why this is interesting is because this is the analogy to how the Greater Bay Area will work, which we're just about to talk about. But first, I want to talk briefly about real-world data. There's a real-world study which is based on real-world data, and that collects real-world evidence that allows you to support, as I mentioned earlier, a clinical evaluation report so that you can avoid a clinical trial requirement in China. In Hainan, there's a specific system set up for real-world data collection without first having needed to get an NMPA approval. And this is what we think it would look like in Greater Bay Area as well. The idea being that you can sell into Greater Bay if you're a Hong Kong listed product, and then collect real-world data, collect real-world evidence from real-world data in a real-world study that allows you to support an application to the NMPA and therefore avoid the need for a clinical trial. Most interestingly is that November, or important to remember, is that there's a November technical guideline issued last year. So that's the key document that you need to be familiar with. Next slide, please.
Now we will talk about the opportunities for medical devices entering the Greater Bay Area. As of March 2021, there are already more than 4,200 medical devices listed in Hong Kong. That's an increase of 3% compared to last year. But the number of applications for Hong Kong listing is expected to increase substantially due to the Greater Bay Area developments. With the implementation of the use of Hong Kong listed medical devices, it will not only greatly impact the Greater Bay Area, but also China's healthcare and medical device industry, as it encourages innovation and further development. Therefore, we encourage our customers to list their products voluntarily with MDACS now, to ensure they are not caught in the rush once the pathway is clear. In this slide, we compare the population size to countries in Europe to remind listeners about the market potential. The Hong Kong population is a bit less than Switzerland's population, for example, but the population in the Greater Bay Area already exceeds the whole population of the UK. On 1st of July 2017, witnessed by President Xi Jinping, the Framework Agreement on Deepening Guangdong-Hong Kong-Macau Cooperation in the Development of the Bay Area was signed by the National Development and Reform Commission, the People's Government of the Guangdong Province, the Government of the Hong Kong SAR, and the Government of Macau SAR. In February 2019, we've also heard about the Chinese government's Outline Development Plan to improve the Greater Bay Area's quality of medical and healthcare services. Since then, the Hong Kong government has also taken a number of steps to support the Greater Bay Area development. A big step forward was announced late last year when the State Administration for Market Regulation, the SAMR, they issued the work plan in September 2020, followed by the Hong Kong Chief Executive's 2020 policy address, and Guangdong's NMPA's notice in November. It was announced that the University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital will be the first institution in the Greater Bay Area to use Hong Kong registered drugs and common medical devices on a pilot basis. The pilot plan was confirmed to come into force on the same day of the Guangdong NMPA's announcement in January this year. The pilot plan was confirmed to come into force on the same day of the Guangdong NMPA's announcement, as I mentioned. The pilot plan will end on July 31st, 2021. The Guangdong NMPA, in its notice, also addressed the responsibilities of the different departments involved. The registration of medical devices in the Greater Bay Area will be approved and temporarily administered by the Guangdong NMPA instead of the NMPA. Also, the Greater Bay Area medical institutions must be designated by the Guangdong Health Commission for using medical devices imported from Hong Kong. These institutions must be healthcare service providers from Hong Kong or Macau in the form of sole proprietorship and equity or cooperative joint ventures in the Greater Bay Area. The HKU Shenzhen Hospital will be the first hospital to test run the medical devices before the policy extends to cover more designated healthcare institutions, drugs, and medical devices. The China State Council authorized the Hong Kong Department of Health, as well as Guangdong's NMPA and Health Commission, to administer the approved list of importing medical devices that are also recognized as urgently needed for clinical use, technological advanced clinical applications, procured and already used in Hong Kong or Macau public hospitals. The Guangdong NMPA itself is the key responsible person, supported by the other departments listed here in the table.
So this is what the application procedure for the Greater Bay Area look like. Medical institutions in the Greater Bay Area submit the application to the Guangdong NMPA. So it's important that companies first tender for and get their products sold within these medical institutions themselves. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the most recent batch that has been not announced yet, but looked into, about products that will be, or at least that are considered for being sold in the initial instance. And then, Jackie, Guangdong Health Commission.
Right. So the Guangdong Health Commission, they would evaluate whether or not the medical device is urgently needed for clinical use, because that is one of the requirements. They would also make sure that there's no other treatments or devices available for the target patients. And they would also check the ability of the hospital and the staffs to see if the medical devices operate smoothly. And then the Guangdong NMPA would grant the approval for the medical device after the Health Commission has reviewed.
The expectation is that this GBA approval process will be completed and system will be completed by 2022, next year, with the entire supervision system finally put in place for drug and medical devices by 2035.
There has been a pickup in momentum since the start of the year, with 2 announcements about GBA in March this year alone. Actually, on Tuesday, we participated in a webinar event organized by the HKMHDIA as well, which some of you may also have participated in. So they've invited 2 guest speakers, Dr. Ko Man and Mr. Chan Hu Feng, to share China's recent national medical and healthcare related policies. And we will be covering the highlights in this slide. As we stress that the University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital will be first to introduce drugs and medical devices from Hong Kong, the hospital itself have been working on several developments. So right now, electronic health records of Hong Kong patients can be accessed by the HKU Shenzhen Hospital. Also, the HKU Shenzhen Hospital is authorized to arrange follow-up medical consultations from November 10th of 2020, last year, to July 31st of this year, for Hong Kong patients with chronic diseases residing in the Guangdong province. Last month, the Gang Yao Tong program was introduced to enable the use of Hong Kong medical device and drug products in Shenzhen, and supported the selection of 54 imported new drugs and medical devices that is currently being reviewed for approval by the Guangdong NMPA. Dr. Lo Chongmao, the chief executive of the HKU Shenzhen Hospital, announced that these imported products could be accessible in Shenzhen as soon as June this year. According to Dr. Lo, the selected medical devices cover orthopedic, cardiovascular, and surgical products. Dr. Low also explained the factors for selecting these products for the first round. The products had to be urgently needed for the clinical use and cannot be substituted in China. The products should also feature functionalities better than the current existing products in China to treat the patients. Also, the hospital plans to obtain the ISQA certification, short for International Society for Quality in Healthcare. They're going to obtain this certification by the end of this year for its recently established Evaluation Research Center. So all of these developments help move forward the cooperation between Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area Initiative.
So just to finish up, and in summary, we have mapped out on our final slide how Hong Kong MDACS listing through to China-wide approval might work. First, the product should be listed in Hong Kong. Having the product listed in Hong Kong will affect the Hong Kong Public Hospital's decision in the procurement of the medical device, as well as for the designated medical institutions in the Greater Bay Area. As we've talked about earlier, it's also worthwhile to obtain a listing of your product sooner rather than later, because in due course, Hong Kong listing will be mandatory. So it's good to beat the rush.
And then manufacturers would need to tender their product to the designated Hong Kong-owned hospitals in the Greater Bay Area. Currently, the designated medical institutions play a key role in submitting the application of Hong Kong medical devices on behalf of the applicant to obtain the Guangdong NMPA's approval. With the introduction of the Gangyao system, the entire process of bringing medical devices and drugs to the Greater Bay Area from Hong Kong will speed up faster and faster over the time. And it is important to recognize the value of establishing an effective communication with the Greater Bay Area medical institutions.
Once the product is approved by the Guangdong NMPA to enter the Greater Bay Area market, Greater Bay Area sales can begin. This will allow the manufacturer to collect real-world data within the mainland, which will be especially useful for evaluating any ethnic differences where this is required for your NMPA approval. This will allow the NMPA application to be submitted based on real-world data and thereby circumvent the need for China clinical trials.
As mentioned in the previous slide, the Guangdong NMPA is currently reviewing for the approval of the imported 54 medical devices and drug products. It will be very interesting to know, because by the time they announce it, we will have an idea of what would be the market demand of the Greater Bay Area. So thank you for your time, and we will now move on to the Q&A section.
So I think there may be some questions already. Thank you very much for your time, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all.